Here is your supplemental information video for Unit 2, Part 2. All of this information, well, not all of it, but most of this information is not covered in your book. It is somewhat covered by your cartoon guide and also by your BioZone workbook, but I just wanted to make sure that you had a reference that you could go back to before, especially before the national exam. Alright, first thing on the list is convergent evolution. As it says here, species from different evolutionary branches may come to resemble one another if they live in similar environments. And there are some examples for you. I'm going to be going through this very quickly, by the way, so if you need to stop and read, feel free. Also, these slides are posted on my Google Classroom website. Alright, here again, ostriches and emus, located in two totally different areas, similar conditions, very similar looks. And then you can see the sidewinder and the horn rattler are the same way. Alright, here are some more dramatic examples of convergent evolution. Wolf up top. This is a pouched marsupial. It was called the Tasmanian wolf, which is now extinct. It was found in Australia. Again, marsupial, mammal. Similar adaptations, very different organisms. The same is true of bat and bird wings, and then also of fish and marine mammals. Similar adaptations, very different genetic background. So it's a response to the pressures of similar environments. Here is if you want to stop this, you can. Here on the left are a list of mammals, and on the right are a list of marsupials that really exemplify very well convergent evolution. Okay, another topic is counting populations. We talk about there's a lot of this organism, or this organism is endangered and there's only so many left. How do we know this? There are several different ways to estimate a population without having to sit there and count every single one that there is on the planet. The first one's mark and recapture. We did this in class. You capture some individuals, you tag them, you release them back into the wild after a certain amount of time. You then randomly catch a group of organisms, count how many are tagged, mark down both of those numbers, tagged and untagged, release them again, do this over the period of months, and then using a mathematical formula, you are able to predict the actual size of the population to within several percentage points of error. Okay, this works really well on organisms that, number one, you can find easily, and number two, ones that herd are pretty much the target for this, that clump together, and then also things that aren't too small. You can only imagine what it would be like to try and tag an ant. Okay, another way to count things is quadrats and transects. Quadrats is where you have a square, you kind of throw it on the ground, and you either count everything in the square or you count things in random subsquares, and then you use some math to determine the overall population in a given area. A transect is just a quadrat along a line. It allows you to, as you can see here, quadrats touching one another. It allows you to go ahead and, estimate changes in a population over a line, like an ecotone, or say from the shoreline into the ocean. So you can kind of track changes. When you pick a method to count a population, think about what your purpose is. Alright, biodiversity index means how many different sorts of things do you have in a community. So this is not a count of a population as the other things were. This is a count of a community, and to let you know how those different populations are in relation to each other. There's two kinds, the Shannon index and the Simpson index. All you really need to know is that there's math involved. You do some counts, you do some math, and it allows you to say, hey, there's a high biodiversity here, or hey, there's a low biodiversity here. Okay, you need to know the difference between the words richness and evenness. Richness is how many different species you have. Evenness is the ratio of the relative abundances. So if you look at these two boxes and pretend that each color of star is a different species, you can see that there's 5 species on the left and 5 species on the right. So in terms of species richness, they're equally rich. Now look at the evenness. The left-hand side is a heck of a lot more even. So that evenness really tells you something. Like on the right-hand side, this red star could be an invasive species. A white-tailed deer population that is out of control because other things have been lifted or they have more resources available to them. So both of these, both richness and evenness, can tell you about the health of an ecosystem. All right, Hardy-Weinberg principle, all you need to know is the definition. In the absence of outside pressures, variation in genetics will remain constant. So as an example, the giant panda of China really hasn't changed in many, many thousands of years because its conditions have not changed. So it's pretty much stayed the way that it is. So go ahead and look at this. You can see the three types of selection that we've talked about before: stabilizing, directional, and disruptive. These happen when there are changes. But the Hardy-Weinberg principle says that this original population in the assortment of expressed genes that are there, this will not change as long as conditions don't change. All right, island biogeography. Islands are bare when first formed, so how do species get there? They don't just magically appear on the island. And then why do some islands have a lot of different species on them while others have relatively few? This theory also applies to habitat islands on land. For example, Lakes Park in Fort Myers is completely ringed by human settlements and roads. So it's essentially an ocean that organisms that live in Lakes Park cannot cross or they're going to die. So a habitat island is one where the animals are essentially trapped within that area. So this stuff applies there as well. Okay. How do the animals move? Well, humans bring stuff intentionally or accidentally. Animals can carry other animals or plants. Ocean currents, wind can blow organisms there. Land bridges. Remember that the United States used to be connected to the Eurasian continent through a land bridge that stretched from Alaska over to Eurasia. And then also stepping stone islands. As an example, the Polynesian islands, organisms have, through looking at genetics, we now know that organisms kind of hopped their way down these islands to get to New Zealand. All right, so how does this happen? There is an opening in a niche. There's no competition. If there are endemics there, they're not utilizing the resources very well, and then it's accessible. So here are some things you need to know. Immigration rates decrease as the island diversity increases, because there's not any room for them. And then extinction increases as the island diversity increases. More competition, more stuff dies out. Species equilibrium on islands is a balance of immigration and local extinction. Stuff coming in, stuff going out. There is a sweet spot between the two. Now, there are two factors that determine biodiversity on an island according to this theory: distance from the mainland and size. The closer you are to the mainland, the more species; the further, the fewer species. And then the bigger the island, the more species can be there. The smaller the island, the fewer. So this is the sweet spot I was talking about. Every island has what you could call an island carrying capacity for an ecosystem. That at some point, immigration and extinction balance each other out, so that there is a sweet spot in the number of species that a particular island can handle. And you can see that sweet spot changes based on large or small. You can see fewer species for a small, more for a large. And then again, near and far, same deal. Be able to read a graph, people. Okay, so when you look at this, which island would have the largest population based on these two things here, number 1 and number 2? The answer is D. It is the large island that is close to the mainland. Which one would have the lowest biodiversity? It would be A. Small and far away. Okay, reminder, Alfred Russel Wallace also researched natural selection. He didn't receive credit because he published second, but he's still important because he independently verified that natural selection is the mechanism for evolution. All right. Don't forget, there are only 3 things a population can do when faced with environmental change, and this includes competition. You can move away. You can have a pre-adaptation in place that allows for niche evolution. to basically roll with the punches or niche partition or any of this stuff. Or you can go extinct through competitive exclusion. All right, character displacement, just as a reminder. Those birds that are right there are all from the same species, but you can see they have vastly different beaks. Character displacement is when you see more of one particular type of character when when an environment changes to favor that particular characteristic. Remember, they don't magically create these adaptations. The adaptations already have to be in place. As an example, some years in the Galapagos, which is where these birds are from, there are seeds with thick shells. So that means that the birds with the big crushy bills, you see lots of them after a couple of seasons because their adaptation is favored and they're more likely to survive. In years where the seeds have thin shells, but they're kind of tough to get at because they're kind of inside of whatever cone it is they grow in, or however it is, wherever it is that they're kind of buried in the plant, the ones with the little thin pincher-like bills are the ones that can get to it best. Now again, they do not magically grow these bills in response to the environment. If, for example, seeds were tough to get into one year and there was not the pre-adaptation there of the big crushy bills, that species would die out, period. Alright, just know that homologous structures are structures that are similar because of common ancestry. Turtles, alligators, birds, and mammals have limbs that are jointed in the same way, so that lets us know that they came from probably a single source. And if these red lines look familiar, they should, because it's just like a phylogenetic tree. It kind of shows that evolution took place. This is just one of many pieces that allows us to know that evolution took place. Just remember that fossils are the number one way we know that evolution is a thing. Okay, genetic drift. Genetic drift is when two populations both experience random mutations, and because there is something keeping them from getting together and having a gene flow, in other words, organisms from one population are not allowed to mate with organisms from another population, this is where you have speciation. So, again, local spreading of alleles, they eventually are passed on to the entire population. That's gene flow. But if the flow is blocked either by a physical component in allopatric speciation or in a behavioral component, which is sympatric speciation, gene flow is blocked. Variations accumulate. Each population's dominant genes drift away from each other, eventually leading to two distinct species. Okay, I'm going to go back here real quick. I know this is annoying, but this is important because, hello, AP Environmental, you're making connections. So, when you look at something, like this graph of disruptive selection, you should immediately be thinking, if those two populations stay away from each other long enough, you'll have two distinct species. That's kind of the point here. Okay, back to our regularly scheduled program, blah, 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 blah. All right, so special types of speciation. Founder effect. The organisms that end up in a new place, like an island, are where the genetic variation comes from. I know this seems really simple, but as an example, the folks who migrated to Ireland, they had that redhead gene and they had it in full force, which is why you see so many people from Ireland with red hair. If it had been a black-haired person, then Ireland would be known for all of their black hair. Scarlet ibis are the same way. There is a genetic variation in white ibis where occasionally one is born with the scarlet coloration, and it got fixed in Trinidad and Tobago, which is why you only find this colored dude there. These ladybugs really exemplify it. So you have a population where you have equal amounts of the red and the yellow. The one with the red gene ends up on the island. Therefore, all of the bugs that are on the island are red shells. Okay, so founder effect. Bottleneck effect. New populations genetics based only on survivors. So you have a catastrophe. Drastically reduced population. The surviving individuals then determine the genetic variation of the next generation. So you can see it definitely changes it, but then look at this. It also leads to a genetically simplified population. And the fewer genes that you have in a population, the less likely it is able to be pre-adapted for change. So this is a sign that a species may eventually go extinct. We see this a lot with organisms where their populations dip too low. So we're going to talk about this in the conservation section. Okay, biomass versus energy pyramid. You guys are familiar with the fact that only 10% of energy goes up the food chain, which is why this pyramid looks like this on the right. Here on the left, it's based on biomass. Kind of a similar idea, but it's, I think, a truer representation of how much an organism has to eat in order to survive. Biomass is the amount of mass that there is in an organism after you take all the water out. So you can see here, it's rather dramatic in terms of it's not halved and it's not a smooth line like the energy pyramid. It is absolutely this, to me, this kind of looks like a submarine type thing. It's a dramatic shrinking as you go from level to level to level. All right, generalist versus specialist. Generalists do great in a wide variety of conditions. They thrive during times of change, wide range of tolerance. This is often a characteristic of an invasive species. Specialists do well when things don't change, specific conditions, and they also have a narrow range of tolerance. They like this little tiny sweet spot, and if things vary too much, they're like, yeah, we're not good. They're more likely to be threatened and endangered. They're more likely to be endemic. They are less likely to be involved in competitive exclusion because its niche is already so narrow and it's so good at filling that niche. Lots of species are in the middle. No examples of generalists and specialists. Generalists are things like cockroaches. Specialists are things like the giant panda of China. Generalists are usually R strategists and specialists are usually K. All right, pathogen and vector. Pathogen is a parasitic microorganism. How does it get from host to host? It has its own little UPS truck called a vector. Mosquitoes are vectors for the protozoan that causes malaria. Rats are vectors for fleas, which are vectors for the bubonic plague. Okay, so that organism doesn't cause the disease, it merely makes a special delivery. Okay, indicator species is one species that you can watch that indicates the health of the entire ecosystem. It monitors, you can pick one for any of these things. Water and air quality, habitat loss, health of the entire ecosystem, changes in general conditions, overhunting, increase in parasites, increase in UV radiation. There are species that are very sensitive to these, that are easy to find, that if you're like, oh God, what happened to all the frogs? Well, then that tells you the entire ecosystem is getting ready to undergo some major changes because that one species tells you what's up. Okay, here are some examples. Birds, butterflies, amphibians, like frogs and salamanders and lichen are all indicator species. Try and think about what they're indicator species of. Amphibians are really good indicator species of water pollution. They're also good indicators of UV pollution because their skin is not a lot of protection there. Then lichen are a good indicator of air pollution. We saw this already when we talked about the peppered moths and how the population skewed from the light gray to the black because of the loss of the lichen during the Industrial Revolution. The lichen died out because of the air pollution that was going on. Canaries in a coal mine, I talked about this in class. Canaries were brought down in coal mines. If the birds dropped dead, the miners knew to run because they're very sensitive. They breathe very quickly, so they're very sensitive to pockets of toxic gas. Coriolis effect, all I expect for you to know is that the atmosphere is deflected because of the rotation of the Earth. I encourage you to go to this YouTube link and watch the Coriolis effect. All right, convection cells, you need to know that it's Hadley by the equator. The ones between 30 and 60 degrees above and below the equator are called feral, and then the polar ones are at the very top and the very bottom. You also need to know that deserts most likely occur at 30 degrees above and below the equator because that's where the Hadley and the feral cells meet. Okay, wind currents, just know that because of the polar cells and the rotation of the Earth, you have the wind currents kind of go in all of these different directions. Rain shadow effect. This is how deserts pop up in weird places. You have mountains near an ocean, and near can be a couple hundred miles. So you have wind blow off the ocean, it gets moist, it hits the mountain and gets shunted upwards. Air gets cooler as you go up, which means that the water condenses and it rains, and so it's nice and lush on what's called the windward side of the mountain. Air gets to the top, it starts rushing down, it's now dry, it's going faster, and then also it gets hotter as it goes down, and then you have this hot, dry, quickly moving air that goes across the land that's right behind the leeward side of the mountain, which is over here, and that causes a desert on the leeward side of the mountain. Great example of that. Okay, here's some more pictures. Da, 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 da. There's more. All right, Himalayas. You can see here on the left, on the India side, you have these lush forests, and on the Tibet side, on the other side of the Himalayas, Gobi Desert. Why do the seasons take place? It's because of the tilt of the Earth and then the rotation of the Earth kind of together. And so its orientation towards the sun is why it is that we have seasons. I encourage you to stop and kind of read this and get a grip on how that happens. Latitude versus altitude. Latitude is north or south of the equator. Altitude is how high you go. And as latitude and altitude change, biomes and vegetation change. Here are, and it's very similar. You can see you go from tropical rainforest to polar ice as you go from the equator to the North Pole. Same thing happens as you go up a mountain. Same predictable change in the biomes. Okay, there's another picture showing you the same thing. Same deal here. Know in general where all the biomes are located. You may want to pause on this particular picture or look at the one in your book and kind of know where everything is. Know what biomes are wet and dry, hot and cold. This picture is in your textbook in chapter 6, or you can pause here and kind of take a look. Factors that affect diversity again. The reason latitude and altitude will affect biodiversity is, the colder it gets, the fewer things that you've got. Right, and that's all I got.